So y'all know the drill at this point. I'll be sending you a link to let you know when you can catch this. So if for any reason the Wi-Fi is cutting out or anything like that, you are always more than welcome to jump on, check this out. Something to just kind of keep in mind that is coming up much faster than you would expect is we have our third exam, but it's only going to cover 3 chapters. It's going to cover chapter 8, which we are working on right now, chapter 9, which we will start later today, and chapter 10, which is an incredibly short chapter on stress. So the exam will post next week on the 2nd, and then it will be due on the 9th. So I realize that's a really fast turnaround time, but in terms of content, especially when we start getting to stress, this should be some of the easier sections to work through. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and show share screen, and let's go ahead and continue our discussion of thinking, language, and intelligence. So the last time that we were here, we were starting to talk about intelligence and intelligence tests. So the last time that we were here, we were talking about the fact that when we look at the IQ of a population, and remember that this is a standardized test. So the idea is your IQ is determined by comparing your score with a pre-tested standardized group. So when we look at this, here are a couple of things that we know about a normal distribution. And for those of you that are kind of stats nerds like I am, one of the things that's actually really cool about the normal distribution is that generally, for any psychological variable that we want to look at, it does generally tend to be normally distributed in a population if you have a large enough sample. So if you want to look at something like height, or if you want to look at something like how many people are extroverted or how many people are introverted, we're usually going to find that if there is a sufficient sample size or a population size, it's going to end up looking like a normal distribution. So here's what we know. The average IQ score for adults is set to about 100. One standard deviation is about 15 points. So based on the properties of the normal distribution, here's what we know. About 68% of people score within one standard deviation of the mean. That means that 68% of the population has an IQ that falls between 85 and 115. Of an additional 26% when added to that 68%. So this basically encapsulates about 95 or 96% of the population. Are there specific jobs that require employees to take IQ tests? I don't know. I can tell you my experiences with IQ tests were usually to get into gifted programs. I'm not aware of any other time that you would need to take an IQ test unless they were looking for different types of neurodivergences, like if they were looking to see if you had something like autism spectrum disorder, and they wanted to get an idea of whether or not you had any additional intellectual disabilities. So that would be one reason they'd want to look for that, intellectual impairments. If you're really into high IQ and you have a really high IQ, I suppose you could take a Mensa test, which is designed for basically people who are in this 2%. But I don't know, like I have a cousin that's in Mensa, and I'm pretty sure that the only reason she joined Mensa was so that she could say she was in Mensa. So make of that what you will. But generally, most jobs will not require an IQ test, at least as far as I know. So about 95 or 96% of the population has an IQ between 70 and 130. So 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. That basically means that we end up with these 2 different extreme groups. We have a group that have severe intellectual disabilities. We are talking about an IQ less than 70. They make up about 2% of the population. And then we have another 2% of the population that has an IQ that is larger or higher than 130. And those people we would quantify as having very high intelligence. And these 2 groups are significantly different from each other. So now we have to talk a little bit about the genetic and the environmental influences on intelligence. So is intelligence nature or nurture? And I hope you've kind of recognized by this point in the semester that whenever we're asking whether or not a variable of interest is nature or nurture, the answer is usually it's a little bit of both. But generally, we want to see if intelligence actually has a strong environmental component, because if that is, in fact, part of what shapes intelligence, then we can actually do something about it. I kind of mentioned this last week, but the way that our culture tends to think about intelligence is that it's either something you have or something you don't, and you can never, ever change it. And if it turns out that intelligence is something that we can mold and we can shape, then we can actually modify it, and that's helpful. I was saying earlier to some other people, I never thought I'd live to see the day where I was drinking tea through a straw, but here we are. Okay, does anybody need me to go back at all? Okay, thanks. All right, you good? Okay, so one of the things that we know, if you want to look at the genetic contributions to intelligence, we talked about twin studies back in chapter 2. And we talked about them a little bit in chapter 3 as well. So the idea is that we can see how much identical twins versus fraternal twins correlate with each other in terms of intelligence. And the reason that we'd want to compare identical twins and fraternal twins is that identical twins share 100% of the same genes. Fraternal twins are basically siblings. They have about, standard siblings, they have about 50% of the same genes. So here's what we know. So here we have identical twins that are reared together. It's basically the same genetics and the same environment. And you can see that the correlation in intelligence scores is about 0.85. That's really high. Once we see, then we look at identical twins, so they share all the same genes, but they're reared apart from each other. In this case, that correlation drops to about 0.7, which does suggest that there is some small environmental effect. Now compare identical twins reared together to our fraternal twins that are reared together. Here, the correlation is about 0.6. The fraternal twins are the same age and the identical twins are the same age. So the environment is going to be largely the same, but the genetics are different. So this lower correlation for fraternal twins versus identical twins suggests a very strong genetic component to intelligence. Then we have siblings that are reared together. 50% of the same genes, and because they're different ages, they have slightly different environments. They get treated differently because they're different ages. So the correlation of intelligence between siblings is actually not as high as you would think. It's only about 0.45. And then finally, unrelated individuals living together, that's a correlation of about 0.3. So what this kind of tells us is that there's a lot of nature, there's a lot of genetics when it comes to intelligence, but there is a small environmental component as well. Additionally, if we look at adopted children, do they look more like their biological parents, or do they look more like their adopted parents? So here we have correlation between the child and the particular parent in terms of verbal ability. So at the age of 3 years, there's not really a lot of correlation between children and parents. So here we have a correlation between children who are never adopted and their birth parents. Here's adopted children and their birth parents. And then here's adopted children and their adoptive parents. So the correlation at its highest is about 0.15. That's pretty weak. By the time that we get to age 16, here's what we see. Children have a pretty high the correlation between children and their birth parents is pretty high. And we see a similar correlation for adopted children and their birth parents, and not really much of a relationship between adopted children and their adoptive parents. So again, we're seeing a very, very strong genetic component here. But I would also note this correlation is maybe only about it's not even 0.35. That's not a bad correlation, but it's not necessarily very large. So this means that genetics do play a role, but since this isn't a perfect relationship, other things are obviously going to be in play. So we have to talk about heritability. And here's what we know. When we talk about intelligence and how much is due to genetics, we're talking about a concept known as heritability. Now, I want to be really clear. When I talk about heritability, I am not talking about how much, for example, Dee's intelligence is due to genetics, or Mariah's intelligence is due to genetics. Here's what heritability is. It's not about you, the individual, and how much your intelligence is due to genetics. Heritability is about variation within the population. So I've got 4 students here in class right now. And let's imagine that the class wasn't an hour. It was longer, and I gave all 4 of them an IQ test. Does anybody here think that I will get the exact same scores for all of them? No, all of their scores are going to be different from each other. So we have this variability. And if I gave all of you that are zooming in right now, if I gave you an IQ test, all of your scores would be different from each other. So we're looking at variation in the population. Why is my score different from your score? Why is your score different from my score? So when we talk about heritability, we're talking about the variation and the variability that we see within a population. Everybody's going to be different. And it turns out that genetics account for about 50% of the variability that we see in people's scores. So that's really a very, very strong percentage. But here's the thing, it's only 50% that's due to genetics. What does that mean? It means that the other 50% must be coming from other things. So now we have to talk about something, and this is a case where I'm going to kind of rant. I'm going to try not to rant too much because I want to stay on topic, but we have to talk a little bit about IQ, and we have to talk about how this varies across gender and how this also varies across racial groups. And I'm actually going to take a very sharp turn away from your textbook. Like, this is one of the first times where y'all, if you listened to me reading, you've already heard me get very angry about the ESP studies. I'm about to get angry again. So let's talk a little bit about group differences in intelligence test scores. So your textbook is going to talk about all of these reported group differences, and then it's going to say that IQ tests are not biased. Right. Sure. Tell me another one. So I'm just going to kind of get that out of the way right now. They're going to say it's not biased. I don't believe that. So we're going to talk a little bit about why groups differ in intelligence and how we can make sense of those differences. So here's what we know. Racial groups are different in terms of their average intelligence. And I'm going to be really clear here. I think a lot of that is due to environment. And I think that is also due to aspects that we would say are related to privilege. And we'll kind of talk about why I believe that is. Additionally, and I would say that a lot of this is also very tied up with wealth and access. So we know this, people who score high and groups that score high are more likely to attain high levels of education and income. And I would argue that the reason for that is that these groups in particular have access to things that other groups may not. So for example, when I was a teenager, I grew up in a single parent family. My mother had been laid off. I was a junior in high school. And sometimes I would have to use my part-time job's money to help pay bills. Do you think that I had the money to afford an SAT prep class? Probably not. I probably didn't even have money to go and buy books. Compare that to somebody who has enough money to be comfortable. Odds are pretty good they're able to afford access to SAT prep classes, tutors, textbooks, etc. And we do actually find that a lot of the time, the people who score well on these college entrance exams, they have access to courses, they have money, and they have the ability to boost their score in a way that people without that access don't. Yeah, I'm getting mad. You can tell I'm angry. Okay, so here's what we know. Avery and others reported back in 1994 that in general, white Americans tend to score higher in terms of average intelligence than Black Americans do. And that's also true for Latinx Americans as well. I know it says Hispanic. I should have changed that to Latinx, my bad. I will say Asian Americans do tend to score higher than any other group. But we do know that there are differences. So it's been reported that white Americans tend to have an IQ of about 100. Black Americans tend to have an IQ of about 85. I do not think that those differences are necessarily legitimate ones. I think this is something very much related to wealth. I think this is something related to access. And I think it's also something related to who writes the test. Guess who writes the test? Usually it's white people. So here's what we know. And here's why I don't really put a lot of stock in these differences. Oh, yes, the classism of, oh, we're getting there, Pandora. She said the inherent classism of IQ tests is astounding. I would also add, generally, it's also, literally. So yes, it is classist. It's also kind of racist. It's also kind of sexist. And we're going to get into those aspects. Yes, and I would say that's really important. All of these things are really important. So here's what we know, and here's why I'm going to argue that these differences are environmental in nature. These are not due to inherent differences between groups. I would like to remind you that in general, race is something that is socially constructed. It is generally, genetically speaking, you probably have more genes, you might have more genes in common with somebody of a different race than you necessarily do with somebody of your own race. But here's what we know. Our genetics are similar. 99.99999 repeating. We all have the same genes. We're Homo sapiens. Additionally, there are schooling effects. And so this is, again, is another instance where classism and racism come into play. If you are going to a good school, that good school probably has a lot of money. Odds are pretty good too that that school is largely, not necessarily so, but at least in my hometown, the good schools tended to be more white. And generally, let's take this out of the United States and let's consider cross-culturally what else is going on here. So if we go to a place like Japan, they actually have higher IQs than Americans do. Now, some of that is attributable to the fact that their culture values schooling much more than ours does. Their children spend longer time in school. They go to school on weekends. Can you imagine anybody wanting you to go to school on weekends? How would that go? Yeah, I don't think it would go very well, but over there they do it. And additionally, they very much have a culture that is centered on schooling and testing and doing your best. So there does seem to be a very high correlation with schooling. We also know about something called the Flynn effect. Now, I'm going to put this out there. The Flynn effect is starting to change in some countries. But here's what the Flynn effect basically is. If I took you, your parents, and your grandparents, and I gave you all an IQ test, your parents would score better than your grandparents, and you would score better than both your parents and your grandparents. So we kind of find that from generation to generation, IQ is increasing. That effect is kind of starting to level off a little bit in certain places, but it has been documented. Additionally, here's something else. When you give intelligence tests to infants of different races, there's no differences between the groups. None. Which means that whatever we are seeing is A, largely environmental, and B, due to biases in the testing. And we find gender differences too. Yay. So here's what we know. In general, and here's the thing. I want to be very, very clear. Differences are not necessarily meant to be a claim for one group being superior or one group being inferior. It's why I always get a little cagey when we talk about differences between genders or racial groups, because it's one small step from saying there's a difference to one group going, well, that just means my group's better than your group and my group should be in charge. And if you look at the history of IQ testing, and if you'd like to especially learn more about racism in psychology, I'm going to share a book for you, and I think it's really interesting. I'm going to put it on the Discord. It is called Even the Rat Was White. So the book is called Even the Rat Was White. I actually found it a very interesting book. Not only does it talk about the racism in psychology, but it also spends a lot of time talking about Black psychologists that you probably didn't hear that much about in your textbook, the history of historical Black colleges, and basically helping give rise to these psychologists. I would highly encourage you to check it out. It's very cool. But when we look at gender differences in IQ, we do see some things. Generally, men tend to do better in math aptitude, but this is culture specific. So for example, here in the United States, I don't know how this happened, but we basically have this idea that math is for boys and not for girls. And because of that, we do see some differences, but not necessarily everywhere. In other cultures like the Middle East, where it's actually assumed that women will be just as good at mathematics as men are, we don't really see these kind of differences. Okay. Is this similar to the sexism in testing for and diagnosing neurodivergency? Yes. So something that's kind of related to this, not to get too off track, I talked about this a little bit in the readings on SoundCloud for autism spectrum disorder, for example. It was believed for a while that this was only a disorder that males had. And even one of the leading researchers in autism spectrum disorder, Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a cousin to Sacha Baron Cohen, my name is Borat. Yeah, that guy. So Baron-Cohen actually kind of categorizes autism as extreme male brain. And with time and with increasing diagnostic tools, we do know that women with autism do not look like how men with autism look like. We are not Sheldon Cooper. I don't even think most people with autism are Sheldon Cooper. But if you're interested in learning more, I can kind of share my experiences, because this is something that, well, hits kind of home for me. And I'm happy to kind of talk about that with you. We do find that men tend to do better in tests of mental rotation, but again, this is something that is kind of based on the kind of games that boys play compared to the kind of games that girls play. It's kind of a socialization thing. If some of you are hardcore gamers and you do first-person shooters that require a lot of spatial dexterity, odds are pretty good you wouldn't see that gender difference. They actually have greater variability in IQ. So what this means is that they're much more variable. You see more geniuses that tend to be male, so to speak. You also see more, for lack of a better phrase, idiots that are male too, or rather intellectual deficits. I shouldn't have used the word idiots, I apologize. But in terms of intellectual deficits, they tend to be more likely to be male. In terms of extremely high IQ, they tend to be male as well, because there's greater variability. Women tend to perform better on tests of verbal performance. That's largely due to socialization, because parents tend to speak more words to their daughters than they do to their sons. Women tend to do better on tests of object location, and they're also better at detecting emotions. Again, this is largely because of socialization. You have been, if you're female, you've probably been socialized to nurture and think about other people and their feelings in a way that you might not have necessarily had to do if you were male. So I would argue that some of these differences are due to socialization. So what arguments do we have against this idea that these differences that we see in racial groups are inherent? First of all, that gap is closing. You are seeing less intellectual differences in racial groups than you ever really saw before. I would also argue that part of it is that, again, the test is written by the people in power, and it was started by people in power. And these tests are going to tend to value what the culture values. And so one thing that you can kind of do if you want to kind of avoid these kind of biases is do what is called a culture fair test. And I will show you that before we move on to motivation. And there is some data that shows that these kind of racial differences or gender differences can actually be flipped on and off like a switch. We're going to briefly talk about something called stereotype threat. Now, one thing that I will mention, people are starting to find that some of these stereotype threat findings do not replicate very well, but some of them still do. So generally, we have what's called stereotype threat. So I want you to imagine this. So a stereotype threat is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. So let's imagine that you're female and you go in and you take a math test. And on this math test, you have to check a box that says, that basically identifies your gender. So I'll go ahead and check the female box. I identify as female, and then I take the math test. So this test has already highlighted that I had to point out that I'm female. And I'm taking a math test, and here in the United States, we tend to treat math as something that is for boys. So I'm taking this test, and I start getting nervous, because if I do badly on this test, I am not just blowing it for me, all of a sudden I am blowing it for all female identifying people everywhere. So there's this idea that if I do badly on the math test, people are going to assume that it's because I'm female. And because of that, I get stressed out. And are you going to be able to do math very well when you're stressed out? Probably not. So it basically creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how many of you have heard of this XKCD cartoon? There's a guy doing a math equation on a board, and another person comes up to him and goes, "Wow, you suck at math." And then you have the exact same image, but you have a girl doing the equation, and the person goes, "Wow, girls suck at math." That's kind of the idea. So what you're looking at here is research by Steele and Aronson in 1995. So this was a study that was done with groups of Black participants and white participants. And they were basically asked to take SAT questions. And so here's what's really important. All of the participants were put into two different groups. And so one group is called the non-diagnostic group. So this group was basically told, hey, you're going to take some SAT questions. These are questions that we're just testing out for a future test. So pretty straightforward. This is basically a control condition. And you can see no differences. There are no racial differences here. That changes, though, if you have this other group of people and you basically tell them that how you do on this test is indicative of your intellectual ability. And then all of a sudden we see a difference. And that's largely because it's creating stereotype threat. So your book tells you all of these things and then says, but IQ tests aren't racially biased. And I'm just like, you can't do that to me. You give me all of this information that shows that a lot of these differences that we're seeing are environmental, but no, the test isn't the problem. Right. So really quick, before we move on, I did actually want to show you one of the ways that we can kind of work around some of the problems of IQ tests. So we're going to look up something called a culture fair intelligence test. So there are a couple of different tests. There's one that's developed by Cattell, but in particular, one that I'm going to show you is called Raven's progressive matrices. So this is something that actually correlates really, really highly with IQ. And here's how it kind of works. Oh, that one's my favorite. So it's kind of hard to see here. Let me see if I can open image in new tab. That would be great. Can I see it, please? So what you're kind of looking at here on the screen is, it's kind of a puzzle, and I think it's kind of fun. So the idea here is that you have a matrix of items, and you're basically supposed to fill in the item that best completes the pattern. So I know it's kind of hard to see here. This one was always my favorite. We used to have to give these in grad school and to kids and college students. And when I finally figured this one out, it was amazing. So the idea here is I've got 3 outside and I've got 4 inside. So it's kind of a subtraction thing. So if I've got 3 outside and 4 inside, that means I have a net of 1 inside. I've got 2 outside, 1 outside, that means 3 inside. I've got 1 inside, 2 outside, that means I should have 2 outside. So the correct answer is number 5. Just trust me on this one. But the idea behind this is that you don't need to have a good working knowledge of language or mathematics or memory abilities to be able to do this. You don't really have to worry about language or anything like that at all. And so because of this, it actually correlates really highly with IQ. And you don't have to worry about some of those issues related to what the culture values. So culture fair tests are actually pretty cool. And I'd encourage you, if you like puzzles, you'll really like the Raven's progressive matrices. And they get tougher as you go. That's why we call it progressive. Those are pretty cool. All right, let's talk about something that you probably don't have much of right now, yeah? And these slides are up on e-learning. We're going to talk about motivation. Raise your hand if your motivation is really good right now. Nope. Yeah, this is a hard, like October is always the toughest. Can't get it under. Okay. So when we talk about motivation, I think one of the easiest ways to actually see motivation is to see what you're like when you don't have it. That was me on Saturday. I had not have any motivation at all whatsoever. I was just like, I'm going to snuggle the dog, and then I'm going to play Animal Crossing, and I don't really feel like doing anything today. And then somebody told me to get up and do something, and I went, come on, it's gross outside. So we can tell when we don't have motivation. So what does that leave us with respect to what motivation is? Motivation is a need or a desire that basically energizes our behavior and directs it toward a goal. You know that you have motivation when you are just driven to getting something done and it's going really smoothly and you're just feeling like you can keep going. So here's a question. Why do you think people go to college? Huh? Well, not necessarily. You've been told that if you want a job that is meaningful, you got to go to college. Okay. Societal pressure, needing a job. Anybody else? I mean, I definitely wanted to make sure that I could have a job where I would not just be randomly laid off for no reason like my mother was. But maybe for some of you, now obviously that extrinsic motivation is there. I want a job that I can make money at. I want a job that I like. I want a job that doesn't involve, you know, something very basic like customer service or retail or things like that. You want those things. And those are all very external. They're all outside of yourself. Is there anybody here who, and here's the thing, I'm not saying that you can't have those external motivators as well. Is there anybody here who was excited to go to college because they'd get to learn more about the world? because I know that was me. Like, I was starting to learn stuff in my AP classes, and I was like, this is what college must be like. I love thinking about these big ideas and these big things. And so for me, college was absolutely some of that as well. So for some of you, you're more driven by the external factors. Others of you might have been driven more about the internal factors. I love learning things so much that I decided to work at a college and never leave it. That's how much I love school. So we all have a combination of external motivators and internal motivators as well. So now we are going to talk about 3 different perspectives that have been used to explain motivation. So we're going to talk about these 3 in detail. So we're going to talk about something that is called drive reduction theory. We are going to talk about something called arousal theory. And you knew it was coming up at some point. We're going to talk about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. So we're going to talk about that fun little triangle that he has. Everybody, I see people still writing. All right, everybody good? Okay. Oh. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about drive reduction theory. So drive reduction theory is entirely based on your physiological needs. So here's what that means. You need to drink things. You will die if you are not hydrated. You need to eat things. You will die if you don't eat food at some point. At some point, you are going to need to go to the bathroom. You will probably not die from that because eventually your body will take care of that for you, whether you want to or not, but you might wind up with some kidney damage. So we have these different physiological needs. Another example, we need to not be too hot. We need to not be too cold. So we have a variety of these different physiological needs. And this basically will create an aroused state of tension. This is what we call a drive. And that's going to push you towards reducing that state of tension. So here, for example, it's about almost 10:30, and some of you may not have had breakfast yet. So for some of you, you are probably getting really hungry. And odds are pretty good if you're really hungry and your stomach is rumbling, you're probably not thinking all that much about my lecture right now because you're focused on that very, very basic physiological need. You need to eat to be able to live. So you have a need for food and you're hungry. That basically will create a drive and will help you engage in drive reducing behaviors like eating or drinking. You generally do not engage in these behaviors if you do not have a drive for them. Have you ever tried to drink water when you're full and you're not thirsty? It's the worst. So what we are striving for, according to drive reduction theory, is what is called homeostasis, maintaining a very balanced, constant internal state. We're not too cold, we're not too hot, we're not hungry, we're not thirsty. We don't necessarily need to eliminate our bowels or our bladder or anything like that. So we want to have this state of balance. And we will do different behaviors and engage in different activities to help us meet that balance. All right, everybody good? Okay. So something that actually kind of helps us meet those physiological needs, we have what are called incentives. So I want you to imagine that you came to class and you were really hungry, and I walked in the door with a big plate of warm pumpkin muffins or chocolate chip cookies, whichever one you like better. I like pumpkin muffins personally. So generally, incentives are either positive or negative stimuli that basically pull us even further toward reducing our drives. So when you smell food, that makes you even hungrier if you're already hungry, and you're going to meet that need more. If you need to use the bathroom, somebody running water is going to make you want to run to the bathroom even more. In the case of my dog, doing the dishes and hearing running water is a sign that he needs to drink water, and so he ends up drinking more of it. So sometimes if the dog doesn't want to drink water, I go do dishes. Apparently it helps. All right. All right, is everybody good? Okay, how about one more slide and then we call it a day. So we're going to talk about arousal theory now. So here's the thing about drive reduction theory. Many of those needs are physiological. They are critical for our survival. However, drive reduction theory doesn't include all of our possible needs. Arousal theory tends to work better. So how many of you have had, and this is certainly me during summer break, I've been sitting at home by myself so much with very little to do, and there's almost a need for me to get out and do something or get out of town because I'm bored. Now, here's the thing. Do we have a physiological need to not be bored? No. You won't die if you're bored. I know that some of you think you might die because you're bored, but you won't actually die of boredom. Nobody's ever done that. But that's not something that drive reduction theory can explain because it's not a physiological need. So arousal theory is much more general in terms of meeting needs, but it also includes different drives that have nothing to do with our physiological needs. So for some of us, we need to be a little stimulated, and that means that we shouldn't be bored. So if we're bored, we'll go and seek out more stimulation. We'll go visit an amusement park. We'll go ride a roller coaster. Gross. Dr. Gilchrist does not like roller coasters. I don't like how my stomach feels. You know, and if we're too stimulated, we'll find time to calm down. We'll find time to relax. So arousal theory is basically the idea that we have this physical tension or energy at all times. So when we have very high arousal, you're probably having an anxiety attack. If you have low arousal, you're really bored and you might actually fall asleep where you stand. So the idea is that we are looking for an optimum level of arousal. So if our arousal is too high, we're going to engage in behaviors that reduce that. If our arousal is too low, we're going to engage in different activities to enhance that. So curiosity is one of those things. We like to learn about things because it enhances our arousal. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I will tell you next time we're going to talk about hunger and eating behavior and the importance of trying to shoot for a healthy weight. So if talking about food is going to make you hungry, make sure you have a snack. We don't want that drive reduction theory getting involved. All right, everybody, have a great day. I will see you here on Wednesday, and I will see you next time.